In today's Farm Report, the U.S. Department of Agriculture recently announced new promise zones for rural investment. Susan Carter with the USDA has more.
The two new private funds will provide small businesses throughout rural America access to the capital they need to grow and create new jobs.
The Rural Opportunity Investment Fund is a credit. It lends money to infrastructure projects and potentially business interests that are locating or expanding. It's essentially a borrowing enterprise by CoBank.
Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack adds that it's making credit available to communities and potentially companies.
It's basically partnering. It's basically buying an interest in the company. It's investing in the company as an investor.
The latest investors are Innova Memphis and Meritus Kirchner Capital, which are now beginning to raise capital to build up their funds.
The success of these funds will be reflected in the fact that as the businesses they invest in mature, the funds will profit.
And Vilsack says they'll be in a position to continue investing in new business opportunities. In announcing the latest 8 promise zones, part of the commitment is to make an award in each announcement to a tribal area and a rural area.
We're identifying the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota as the tribal area that we will be focusing our efforts on. And South Carolina Low Country, this is roughly an 8-county area in South Carolina. This is an effort on the part of the administration to better coordinate federal resources and the federal approach to economic opportunity to sort of negate the impacts of poverty in rural areas.
The federal government partners with local leaders to increase economic activity, improve educational opportunities, leverage private investment, reduce violent crime, enhance public health, and address other priorities identified by the community. Nick Tolson, Executive Director of Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation, where the Pine Ridge Tribal Promise Zone is located.
We went through a process, about a 24-month process, in which we created a plan for Pine Ridge called the Oglala Lakota Plan. Investment was an original investment made by HUD, and it created a systematic approach for us to revitalize our culture, to focus on housing, to expand educational opportunities, and to build the workforce. And this Promise Zone designation gives us the opportunity to continue that investment. The Sustainable Communities Regional Plan has leveraged about $15 million of new investment into Pine Ridge over the past 36 months. So we wholeheartedly believe in this systematic approach to building capacity at home and having the ability to address not just isolated projects, not just infrastructure, not just housing, not just education, but looking at all those things collaboratively together.
Grady Vanderhoeven of Meritus Kirchner Capital says his firm has set a goal of raising $100 million to invest in rural businesses and communities.
Our experience indicates that for those who are willing to dig and sift and search and seek, there are exceptional opportunities in these areas. And for those with the networks and the experience necessary to support the companies in which investments are made, we invest in revenue growth, and that creates wealth and jobs.
For the full list of Promise Zone recipients this round, go to the USDA website at www.usda.gov. For USDA Radio, Susan Carter, Washington, D.C.
The Farm Bill required a study of the costs of mandatory country of origin labeling and any possible increased sales or demand because of cool labels. That study's done, and it shows
a lot of evidence of cost of compliance and little to no evidence of actual increased demand.
Kansas State University economist Glenn Tonsor, one of the authors of the study with lots of numbers, but
the main punchline would be the beef industry and the pork industry all lose.
Beef industry losing about $8.5 billion over 10 years. Pork industry $1.7 billion, as the costs of compliance with the rules outweigh any increases in sales that might be attributed to the label. Now, Tonsor says, yes, demand for beef and pork is up, but
there's no evidence that the reason that demand has been strong is from mandatory country of origin labeling.
One reason the study shows losses so high, benefits zero, is that the vast majority of beef and pork sold in the country is already U.S. produced, so the chances for any big increase in sales of U.S. product is already pretty small. Also, meat sold in restaurants is exempt from cool. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
Spring has been a little late this year, but it's finally here, and with it comes a list of things to do in the yard. Gary Crawford with the U.S. Department of Agriculture has more.
Each nest is twittering, they're all babysittering. It's spring, spring, spring.
At last. And with spring's arrival, many of us were inspired to get out in the yard and do something. And definitely,
there's always a lot of chores to be done in the spring in the lawn and the garden.
Kansas State University Extension Lawn and Garden expert Dennis Patton. Now, he does say that many of the things we do in the yard in the spring are actually things we probably should have done in the fall. Things like planting grass seed, most of the fertilization, and spraying for weeds. But yes, there's still a lot to do in the spring. First, we need to redo some of the raking of the leaves we did back in the fall. Winter does have a way of blowing more leaves around and into the yard and piling them up in places.
And we want to make sure that those leaves do not pile up and bury the turf grass, because it will shade and kill out the grass.
Dennis Patton says even though we may have done some of these next things he's going to talk about last fall,
in the spring is when we start thinking about, depending on the part of the country we're in, doing a little bit of fertilization to perk the grass up. It's also a time we look for some weed control activity too, because we have a lot of spring blooming weeds like dandelions, henbit, chickweed throughout the country. And then we also need to think about preparing our lawn for the weeds of summer that will be coming later.
But really, Dennis says it would have been better to take care of the broadleaf weeds back in the fall. Why not use those sprays in the spring? Answer?
Because they drift really easily into the breeze, and they can damage non-target plants. Here in my office, our number one plant problem that comes into the Extension office in late May through early June is the result of the broadleaf herbicides. So it affects the redbud trees, the tomatoes that got planted in the spring, grapevines. Any of the trees will see a lot of curling and puckering to the foliage because of the drift of the herbicide in the atmosphere.
So in the spring, he says it's better to do spot spraying of weeds, very targeted, and
use as little as possible. Treat on a calm day, not a windy day, to prevent the blowing and the wind. And then also large water droplets close to the soil surface so we don't get a lot of that drift and cause damage to our non-target plant.
And finally, yes, Dennis says when you go to cut the grass the first time, fight the urge to cut it really low. He says it hurts the grass by scalping it.
The other thing is when you mow so short like that early spring, all you do is open that soil up for more sunshine. And weed seeds love nothing more than spring sunshine and warm soil to start to grow.
Yes, those weeds also love
Spring, spring, spring.
Ah, yes, in Washington, where it's finally starting to warm up. This is Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
The agricultural sector is ramping up production, and transportation is needed. Rod Bain with the U.S. Department of Agriculture talks about how the rail, barge, truck, and other transportation industries can help U.S. egg producers and shippers in moving their goods to market.
As U.S. agricultural production continues at record levels for many commodities, the need for reliable transportation of these products also grows. So what are the farmer and the commodity shipper going to need in the way of transportation support, and in turn, support of their bottom lines? At this year's USDA Agricultural Outlook Forum, Dan Mack of CHS Incorporated provided some examples from the ag shipper's point of view. First,
robust and consistent capacity. We've got to have the ability to move product from A to B in an efficient and consistent manner. It can't be only available certain times of the year. Even though our business is cyclical, it has to be available to be able to meet the market demands that our ag industry needs.
Then there is the need for continued infrastructure investment.
Rail infrastructure investment, barge investment, truck investment.
Also, ag shippers need timely logistical information.
Help us understand what's going on. Help us understand what the logistical scenarios are. Help us to be able to plan. Help us to be able to make good, sound decisions. Help us to be able to tell our customers what to expect. All those things are extremely important in a transportation component.
Max says ag shippers and producers also need freight liquidity and flexibility.
We need to be able to make sure that we've got the ability to have flexible freight, flexible market scenarios. We've got to be able to take advantage of opportunities when they exist and be able to ration freight when it needs to, as well as be able to manage the capacity when it's not needed.
And competitive pricing that reflects market conditions are needed. And
transportation of programs that align with grain markets. As the grain markets evolve, as it changes from one season to the next, what are the programs that are employed by various transportation suppliers that'll help drive markets and grain growth out of the U.S.?
Along with service consistency and the ability to manage peak demand periods.
We do have peak periods in ag, and whether we like them or not, whether they're a hindrance or a benefit, we have peak periods. You're going to have continued peaks in the industry, and we're going to have to continue to learn how to manage that from an asset utilization and from a transportation service perspective.
And Mack notes that most importantly, ag shippers need to develop relationships and accessibility with their transportation providers.
It's really about the communication. It's really about the responsiveness. So it's really about managing relationships, which is a vital need in terms of being successful in managing transportation for agriculture.
I'm Ron Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.